Hey, what's going on, guys? Today we're going to be ranking all of the Umbral based spells. Now, honestly, every single one of these are actually pretty viable. If you checked out my videos on the Radiant and Inferno based spells, there are plenty of them that were just kind of shit and just not viable at all. But with these ones, they're actually all pretty decent. Now, obviously, there are going to be some that are better than others, and probably some do need a buff. But I wouldn't really focus too hard on how I rank them. I would actually focus more on where I place them in the tier list itself. But in terms of Umbral builds or Radiance and Inferno type builds in general, I don't really care for them much because one, there's not many weapon options out there. And two, I don't really like wither damage that much unless I'm pairing it alongside something like poison. Because with my type of playstyle, I'm very aggressive and I'm getting hit a whole bunch, to which I'm just not going to benefit off the damage that I'm actually doing. But one good thing about the Radiance and Inferno type builds is that you're more likely to reach the minimum requirements for all those different types of Radiance and Inferno spells. So if you actually have the rings equipped that actually can cast those spells with different types of catalysts, so you actually can make some pretty decent builds out of this build type right here. But yeah, that is the way, let's just get started. Starting off at the bottom, number 19, we have Blood Harvest. And now this is a melee based spell of which actually has a very long casting animation to where it doesn't really have much range, but it does do a lot of withering damage. And for 66 mana, it definitely is worth it. However, it's really slow, so you're rarely ever going to hit with it, especially being at such a short range, and you get no poise or hyper armor, so you're just going to get staggered out of it in most cases. And in other cases, you're probably just going to trade out as well, and trading out with a withering type build is not going to be the play because then it's going to get a lot of that health back. And did I mention that it's really slow? Number 18, we have Lingering Despair. Now this spell for 60 mana shoots out a bunch of these balls that actually do stay in a stationary position for a little bit, and when enemies actually walk into them, they can take a bunch of damage. Now when you actually hit with every single one of these balls, it actually can melt enemies very quickly, and for 60 mana, it is actually very nice. However, most enemies are not going to really be walking into these attacks unless you're trying to bait them into it, which honestly, that's not really the most viable thing to do. Now, this actually would be really good against larger types of enemies, but there aren't many large enemies or bosses in this game. And this spell is just directly outclassed by Barrage of Echoes, which kind of does the exact same thing, but just go further, explode upon impact, consume less mana, and probably have higher DPS as well. Number 17, we have Graveyard Fog. Now, this spell for 39 mana actually does summon a Withering Pool, of which when enemies stand inside of it, they'll take that wither damage over time. Now this can actually be really good to fight alongside with at melee distance. You just summon the pool and just keep hitting the enemy with the weapon and they'll take that damage over time with the pool itself. Now unfortunately, I feel like the damage isn't really too high and it doesn't really last that long as well. And there's another spell that you'll see later on this list in Umbral Guardian that kind of just works the exact same way as a spell that can just do passive damage over time and actually be good at crowd control. But that one would just end up doing more damage. But if this one has lasted a little bit longer, I'd probably prefer it more. Number 16, we have Flesh Tide. Now this spell is an AoE of which goes into a forward direction, does actually get more physical than withering damage, and actually does get some poison build up as well, which is really nice and well paired alongside withering type of builds because it means that the enemies have less chance to end up getting their health back. Now the reason why I don't really care much about this spell is because it does do a lot of things, but it doesn't really do anything well. The damage isn't really quite there, the poison build up isn't there, and it is a very long animation. You're basically going to get staggered out of it almost every single time. But the fact that you can do some chip damage for cheap and do some poison build up at a longer distance can actually be a decent option. Number 15, Pestilent Blade. Now for 39 mana, you actually summon this little sword, which does some okay withering damage and actually gets you some pretty decent poison build up as well. Now unfortunately, the damage isn't quite there, especially for how slow the swing actually is itself. It's not going to be as fluid or as smooth as a lot of the weapons you actually will end up using. So I guess the only use and purpose of this is to actually just proc that poison, which actually can do it pretty well, but being that you have to be at close distances means that it's more risky. And in my opinion, there are things you'll see later on this list that end up just proccing poison a lot more consistently than what this actually does. But for 39 mana, you can't really go too wrong. Number 14, we have Umbral Slash. Now this spell actually sends forth a wave projectile that actually can go pretty far, can do some very good damage, and actually go through enemies and hit multiple at the exact same time. Now you can find a lot of success with this spell, but unfortunately it consumes 79 mana, which there's going to be things that you'll see on this list that can do more damage, go further, and end up consuming less mana as well. So you actually can find a lot of success with this spell, but in my opinion, there's going to be better options, hence this one being lower on the list. Number 13, we have Putrefaction. Now this spell for 39 mana actually summons a poisonous cloud to when an enemy stand inside of it. They'll take some poison build up over time. Now it doesn't do any type of damage whatsoever, so obviously the only use is to proc poison. Now in most cases you won't really proc poison straight away, obviously depending on the enemy. So the way I like to use it is just summon the poison cloud and actually have your main weapon with the poison weapon spell equipped to just finish off the poison proc, which is definitely a very decent strategy because this spell is a very quick cast and only consumes 39 mana, so you can't really go wrong. And poison is definitely a necessity for withering type of builds because you just don't want your enemy to like heal at all. So in my opinion, you should basically always have this spell and probably switch off after you're done using it. Number 12, we have Diminishing Missile. Now honestly, at this point onwards, all of the spells are really good and I rarely have anything bad to say about them. In this one in particular, the spell goes really far, can do some nice damage when it lands upon impact. It actually does a bunch of withering damage over time, and while that debuff is active, if you end up killing the enemy, they end up exploding and doing a little AoE. Now the AoE isn't anything too grand or special, it doesn't really do amazing damage, so its single target damage is definitely going to be the best selling point, but the fact that it can do some crowd control is obviously a plus. Now in my opinion, the reason why this is going to get lower is because I think things like Painful Echo could just be a better projectile, but if you just wanted good single target damage, sit at the back of the map and just spam it against a boss, this one is probably going to be your best bet. Number 11, we have Umbral Guardian. Now this spell for 52 mana actually summons a little guardian that can follow you around and shoot enemies for you. Now this actually works the same way as all the other guardian type of spells, but this one actually is a lot better than those because it actually bounces back and forth between enemies when it actually does land upon one. And when there's like no enemies in the vicinity, it would actually just end up hitting twice sometimes. And also the damage itself is actually still really good and it ends up doing a bunch of that withering damage. So the way to use it is just have it equipped, end up doing that withering damage over time. It does that passive effect and you'll be able to swing your weapons at the exact same time. And if you're doing that physical damage, the enemies won't really have any type of chance to end up getting that health back. So actually it's a very nice pairing and I definitely recommend using this one. Number 10, we have Martyrdom. Now this spell for 66 mana actually summons this big ass giant nail that comes crashing to the ground and do some very high damaging explosion in a smaller AoE, but this spell can actually have some nice range so you can just use it at longer distances and end up just doing a bunch of damage in one hit, and for 66 mana it is absolutely ridiculous. Now the problem that I have with this spell, and the reason that's not going to help me put it to the S tier, is that it's so inconsistent as to when it can actually land. Sometimes it just doesn't track towards the enemy, it just ends up going in a random direction. Sometimes it doesn't even like work and come out at all, and obviously the explosion doesn't happen straight away so enemies can just end up dodging it, but the fact that it can do so much damage in one hit makes it really good. Number 9, we have Diminishing Missile. Now this spell actually does work as a projectile attack, of which does do a little bit of damage upon impact, but it also does debuff the enemies as well. Now it actually does make them take more damage and actually do less damage. Now from my testing, their damage is reduced by 25% and their defenses are decreased by 10%, so you end up doing 10% more damage. But unfortunately, the buff only lasts 15 seconds, which I'm not too big of a fan of. But the fact that you just can debuff the enemy, make them take more damage, and just do less damage is always going to be nice, especially at a distance. But for 48 mana in 15 seconds, I don't really care to use it much, especially when there's buffs in the game like Adir's Rage or Adir's Hardiness that just last 90 seconds and just help buff you in general, so it just works throughout against all types of enemies. But this thing does actually have some very cheap requirements, so you can't really go wrong using this right here. Number 8, we have Grieving Gaze. Now this spell for 80 mana does actually summon this big giant crystal, of which actually does shoot down a bunch of these ice shards that actually end up doing a whole bunch of damage, and being that they actually go into horizontal spread, they actually can be pretty decent for crowd control as well. And on top of that, they end up doing a bunch of that frost build-up, which is obviously really nice. Now I would say the downsides to this spell is that 80 mana is definitely a lot. And the hit detection is kind of weird, doesn't really go exactly where you want it to sometimes because it's not really the quickest thing in the world, so it actually can be pretty easily dodged. But if every single one of those crystals do actually hit, it will end up doing so much damage, and it's not withering damage as well. So it'll just end up being this instant chunk damage off the bat, which is probably the main reason as to why I value this one so much. Number 7, we have Umbral Orb. Now this is just the basic Umbral projectile that you just start off with, only consumes 13 mana and it can go incredibly far, do some okay damage as well, and you can just spam it over and over again. So it's obviously just going to be really good, because if you have a build that doesn't really have much mana to begin with, this can actually be really valuable because the mana to damage ratio is actually insane with this thing. Now in my opinion, there are other types of projectiles that will end up outclassing this, but being that it's so incredibly easy to use and cheap means that it definitely can get a higher A tier. Number 6, we have Umbral Weapon. Now this spell just buffs your weapon with a bunch of more withering damage, and for me, just weapon buffs I'm always going to value because it's going to be in a game where just weapons are just going to be the main source of your damage, and just having a bunch more damage for them that last at 90 seconds, it's going to be extremely valuable. Now once again, I don't really care much for wither damage much unless I'm pairing it alongside poison, so I definitely would like to have some poison spells to pair alongside with this. But the wither buildup that you actually can get alongside Umbral Weapon is actually really good. Number 5, we have Painful Echo. Now this is a projectile spell that works very similar to Umbral Orb, goes just as far, looks the exact same, and has like the same casting speed. But the difference is that this one actually does consume 35 mana, which is like almost 3 times the amount. But thankfully, this thing actually performs really well in that it just bounces off enemies and keeps chaining back and forth. And sometimes it can chain up to like 4 times. So basically you're just doing like 4 times the amount of damage that you would with just a regular Umbral Orb, but you're only consuming 3 times as much mana. So obviously, in terms of the damage to FP ratio, this one is actually extremely good. Now, obviously against single target damage, it's not going to be anywhere near as good. In that instance, I would just rather have Umbral Orb. But being that you can just melt enemies in groups at a longer distance is extremely good. Hence, this one actually ended up being an S tier. Number 4, we have Poison Weapon. Now, this spell just buffs your weapon with just poison damage and actually some flat physical damage as well. And I love this spell because it has carried me all throughout my level 1 run that I just completed. Live on Twitch, by the way, so definitely follow me out there because I am live every day. But this spell has such low requirements, 8 in Radiant and Inferno, which is definitely the cheapest weapon buff in the entire game. And once again, poison is extremely good, especially paired alongside withering builds, because it will make the enemy not be able to end up getting their health back. So for almost every single type of Umbral build, I will end up using poison weapon, unless I'm using like the fungus axe, which already gets poison. In that instance, I'll just end up using the Umbral weapon itself. But yeah, almost any other time, just throw in poison weapon, throw in the ring that can actually help enemies bleed when you proc poison as well. Put in your best withering type of spells, and you'll have an absolute field day with bosses. At number 3, we have Umbral Agony. This is another projectile spell of which actually does summon this big-ass giant ball that actually goes through enemies, can actually hit multiple enemies at once, and when it actually lands upon impact, when it hits like a wall or something like that, it'll end up exploding into this huge AoE that can do some nice damage and hit a whole bunch of enemies all at once. Now, this thing can just do some ridiculous amounts of damage because it'll just end up hitting enemies multiple times. It'll just like go through them in a tick for a whole bunch of damage. You can just end up getting like 2k damage out of one of these bad boys, and for only 52 mana, it definitely is worth it. And this thing can also serve as just a very nice crowd control type of spell, because if you're just surrounded by a bunch of enemies, you can just throw it at the ground, end up exploding into this big ass AoE. So yeah, I definitely recommend using this one right here. Number 2, we have Latimer's Javelin. Now, this spell is yet again another projectile, which for 52 FP, you just yeet this big ass javelin that does a whole bunch of damage, and upon impact, it explodes into a nice AoE as well. But this spell is just really good at everything. It has decent travel distance, really good damage, good at crowd control. Now, obviously, it's not going to be the cheapest thing at 52 mana. There are other projectiles that will end up being cheaper, but being that it mainly does physical damage, being how quick that it actually can be casted, is just very easy to use. At number 1, we have a Barrage of Echoes. This thing, it just gets everything that you need, honestly. It's just insane. Now, for 39 mana, basically what you're doing is just sending forth a whole bunch of bubbles that just explode upon impact. Sometimes enemies can just be near it. They'll just instantly explode. It'll do a fuck ton of damage, being that it goes on a nice horizontal spread. It's good at hitting multiple enemies at once. And then I mentioned that it does a fuck ton of damage because it really does do that much damage. It's actually insane. And for only 39 mana, it does this. And you can spam it over and over again. I guess that's a pretty quick cast. And the range itself is not even that bad. The fact that it gets a nice horizontal spread, only 39 mana, and it goes that far, that quickly, and does this much damage. What? How? Anyway, that pretty much concludes it for that one. That's literally all the spells, all ranked for Radiance, Inferno, and Umbral. If you want me to go over anything else, like the crossbows or the throwable weapons, or just weapons in general, definitely let me know down in the comments. But yeah, as always, see you in the next one, guys. Bye.